The chestnut mare tore past the bank window at a dead gallop, reins whipping like snakes, saddle empty, hooves throwing dust high enough to blot the morning sun. Delia Tanner's pen froze mid-stroke. The ledger page blurred. She knew that horse. She knew the brand on its flank. And she knew the man who owned it would come looking, because men like him always did. She dropped the pen, shoved back from the desk, and ran. Outside, the street exploded into shouts. A wagon swerved. A woman screamed. Delia hit the boardwalk just as the surveyor vaulted a hitching post and sprinted straight into the path of the bolting animal. She didn't think. Her feet moved. She grabbed a coil of rope from the hardware store porch and ran into the street, swinging the loop overhead the way her father had taught her, before the bank took everything, before the debt, before she learned that running was the only skill that mattered. The mare veered. The surveyor lunged. Delia threw. The rope caught. The mare reared, screaming. The surveyor grabbed the bridle and went down hard in the dust, rolling, boots skidding, hat flying. Delia hauled back on the rope, boots sliding, shoulder wrenching, apron tearing. The horse planted its hooves. Foam flew. The surveyor held on, talking low and rough, hands steady even as blood ran down his knuckles. Slowly, the trembling stopped. The mare dropped its head. The street went silent, except for the ragged breathing of three creatures, who had all just gambled with death and won. The surveyor stood, dusting his jacket with one hand, still gripping the bridle with the other. His eyes met hers across the settling dust. Gray, exhausted, and sharp enough to strip paint. He didn't smile. Neither did she. For 3 heartbeats, the world narrowed to the space between them, and Delia felt something she hadn't allowed herself in 2 years. Curiosity. It was dangerous. She dropped the rope and turned to go. His voice stopped her cold. Thank you. 2 words, quiet and deliberate. She looked back. He was watching her the way a man watched a puzzle he intended to solve. Blood dripped from his hand onto the dirt. The mare nuzzled his shoulder. And Delia knew, with the sick certainty of a woman who had run out of places to hide, that Lucian Briggs had just become a problem she couldn't outrun. She walked back to the bank without a word, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the way old Mrs. Carpenter clutched her shawl and muttered about improper behavior. Inside, she locked the door, leaned against it, and counted her breaths until her hands stopped shaking. Then she returned to the ledger and pretended the ink stain didn't look like a noose. By noon, the whole town knew 3 things. The surveyor's horse had bolted because someone had cut the girth strap halfway through. Lucian Briggs carried a contested deed that could reroute the valley's water rights and destroy half the ranches in Juniper Valley. And the engagement scandal that had chased him out of Denver involved a banker's daughter, a broken promise, and enough money to make people ask questions Delia did not want anyone asking about anyone. She was refiling the water contracts when the bank door opened, and Lucian Briggs walked in, hat in hand, mare tied outside. He didn't waste time. I need to see the land records for Whisper Ranch. His voice was sandpaper and smoke. Delia's fingers tightened on the filing drawer. That's county business. Try the courthouse. He stepped closer. The courthouse burned last spring. Everyone knows the bank holds the copies. She met his eyes and saw the exhaustion there. The kind that came from fighting too long, with no rest in sight. She also saw the edge of desperation that made men do stupid things. I don't have access to those files. You'll need to speak with Mr. Howell. He leaned one hand on the desk. His knuckles were still wrapped in torn bandana cloth. Then I'll wait, he said. She worked. The silence stretched like a tripwire. Outside, the afternoon sun crawled across the floorboards. Delia could feel his attention on her like a weight, pressing against the careful walls she'd built around every truth she couldn't afford to tell. When the clock struck 3, she closed the ledger with a snap that made him blink. Mr. Howell won't be back until tomorrow. You're wasting your time. Lucian stood slowly, settling his hat with the care of a man deciding whether to push or retreat. Then I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Tanner. He knew her name. That was bad. She watched him leave, watched him untie the mare, and walk her down the street with the gentleness of someone who understood what it meant to be hurt and still have to keep moving. And she hated the way her chest tightened at the sight, hated the flicker of recognition that whispered you know exactly what that feels like. That night, Delia walked the long way back to her rented room above the dress shop, checking over her shoulder twice, avoiding the saloon, the hotel. The places where strangers gathered and asked questions. She climbed the narrow stairs and locked herself in. The room was small, clean, and empty of everything except necessities. No photographs, no letters, no past. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the tin box from under the floorboard. Inside, 3 things. $42. A train ticket east, dated for next month, and a crumpled note that read, "You owe me, and I always collect." She put the box back and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would tell Mr. Howell about the deed. Tomorrow, the ranchers would panic. Tomorrow, Lucian Briggs would become the most hated man in Juniper Valley, and she would fade back into the shadows where she belonged. It was a good plan. It was safe. It was exactly what she needed. So why did her hands still smell like rope and dust? And why could she still see those tired gray eyes watching her, like she was the first real thing he'd seen in months? She didn't sleep. At dawn she dressed, braided her hair tighter than necessary, and walked to the bank with her head down and her shawl pulled close. Mr. Howell was already inside, counting cash with the grim focus of a man who knew his world was balanced on the edge of a blade. He looked up when she entered. "Miss Tanner." "Good. I need you to pull every land contract tied to the Eastern Creek. Do it quietly." She nodded. "What happened?" He smiled, and it was the saddest thing she'd seen in weeks. A surveyor from Denver has a railroad deed that supersedes the water agreements. If it holds, Whisper Ranch loses its access, and so does everyone downstream. Half the valley dies of thirst, and the railroad builds straight through. Delia pulled the files. Her hands didn't shake. They never did when the crisis was someone else's. She spread the contracts on the desk, tracing the boundaries, the dates, the witness signatures. Everything was in order. Everything was legal, and none of it mattered, because the railroad deed was older, federal, and absolute. She looked up. "Can it be challenged?" Mr. Howell shook his head. "Not without proof the original survey was fraudulent. And that surveyor's been dead 20 years. She sat back. "What will they do?" He closed the file. What desperate men always do. "They'll fight." Lucian Briggs arrived at 10. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a lawyer, a federal marshal, and a rolled document sealed with wax that looked like a death warrant. Mr. Howell met them in the lobby. Delia stayed at her desk, head down, pen moving, ears open. The conversation was short and brutal. The deed was legitimate. The survey was final. The railroad had the right to reroute the creek, and construction began in 30 days. Whisper Ranch and every farm downstream would be dry by summer. The marshal left first. The lawyer lingered, whispering something to Lucian that made his jaw tighten. Then they were gone, and the bank was silent, except for the sound of Mr. Howell pouring whiskey into his coffee. Delia stood. "I'll take the contracts to the courthouse." He waved her off. "No point. It's done." She hesitated. "What about the families?" He drank. "They'll sell, or they'll leave. That's the West, Miss Tanner. You run out of water, you run out of time." She left without another word, tucking the contracts under her arm, stepping into the bright, cruel sunshine. The street was quiet, too quiet. She felt the stares before she saw the crowd. They were gathered outside the general store, 24 ranchers and farmers, faces hard, voices rising. At the center stood a tall man in a battered hat and canvas coat, hands spread, trying to calm the storm. That's when she saw Lucian, standing off to the side, alone, watching the mob with the stillness of someone deciding whether to run or stand. Someone threw a rock. It hit the dirt near Lucian's boots. He didn't flinch. The tall man, she recognized him now, Garrett Moss, owner of Whisper Ranch, shouted for order. But the crowd was past listening. Another rock flew. This one hit Lucian's shoulder. He staggered, caught himself, and still didn't move. Delia saw the resolve in his face, the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who'd been blamed for everything wrong in his life and had stopped arguing. And something inside her cracked. She stepped into the street. Her voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Stop." The crowd turned. She walked forward, contracts clutched to her chest, chin high, every eye on her. "You want someone to blame? Blame the railroad. Blame the federal land office. Blame the drought. But he's just the messenger, and breaking his skull won't bring your water back." Silence. Then Garrett Moss stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "You defending him, Miss Tanner?" She met his stare. "I'm telling you the truth. Mobs don't fix broken deeds. Lawyers do. If you want to fight this, go hire one. If you want to feel tough, keep throwing rocks at a man who's already bleeding. Your choice." The crowd shifted. Someone muttered. Someone else spat. Slowly, they broke apart, drifting back toward the saloon, the feed store, the hitching posts. Garrett Moss held her gaze a moment longer, then tipped his hat and walked away. When the street was empty, Delia turned to Lucian. He was staring at her like she'd just pulled him out of a river. "Why'd you do that?" She didn't have a good answer. So, she told the truth. "Because I know what it's like when everyone decides you're the villain." He studied her face, and she saw the exact moment he stopped seeing a clerk and started seeing a person. "That's dangerous, Miss Tanner." She almost smiled. So is standing still when rocks are flying. "What's your point?" He walked her back to the bank. Neither of them spoke. When they reached the door, he stopped. "I'm staying at the hotel. Room 12. If you need anything." She shook her head. "I won't." He nodded slowly. If you change your mind, then he left. And she went inside and sat at her desk and tried to remember why protecting a stranger was the worst idea she'd had since coming to Juniper Valley. That night, someone set fire to the surveyor's camp. Lucian lost his tent, his gear, and every map except the one he'd been carrying. The marshal ruled it an accident. Everyone knew better. By morning, Lucian had moved into a corner of the livery stable, paying the owner in labor, sleeping in straw, and working on his survey by lantern light. Delia heard about it from the dress shop owner, who heard it from the blacksmith, who heard it from his nephew. The whole town was watching, waiting to see if the surveyor would break or dig in. Delia knew which one he'd choose. Men like Lucian didn't break. They just bled quieter. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She had $42 and a train ticket. She had a plan. She had survived this long by staying invisible, and invisible people did not get involved in water wars and railroad deeds. But when she left the bank that evening and saw Lucian leading his limping mare toward the livery, shoulder wrapped in a bandage, face gray with exhaustion, she heard herself say, "That mare needs a farrier." He stopped. "Can't pay one." She crossed her arms. "Then she needs rest and a proper stall." He met her eyes. "I'm aware." She hesitated. "There's an old stable behind the church. No one uses it. He'll be dry, and there's a water trough." He stared at her. "Why are you helping me?" She didn't have an answer for that either, so she walked away. But the next morning, she found a small parcel on her desk. Inside, a handful of sugar lumps and a note in rough pencil. "For your trouble." She looked out the window. Lucian was across the street, talking to the freight driver, gesturing at a stack of lumber. He didn't look her way. She wrapped the sugar lumps in her handkerchief and slipped them into her pocket. That evening, she stopped by the church stable. The mare was there, resting in clean straw, a blanket across her back. Lucian was sitting against the wall, cleaning his surveying tools with a scrap of cloth. He looked up when she came in. "Thought you'd be gone by now." She fed the mare a sugar lump. "Thought you'd be run out of town." He almost smiled. Day's not over. She sat down on an overturned crate. They didn't talk, just sat in the quiet, listening to the mare chew, the wind rattle the roof, the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. After a while, Lucian said, "You're not from here." She stiffened. "No one is." He kept cleaning the brass fittings. "You're careful, the way people are when they're used to watching their back." She stood. "I should go." He didn't stop her. But when she reached the door, he said, "If you ever want to tell me why, I'll listen." She left without answering. That night, she sat in her rented room and stared at the train ticket. 1 month. 30 days until she disappeared again, started over again, ran again. It had worked in St. Louis. It had worked in Omaha. It would work here. All she had to do was stay quiet, stay small, and let Juniper Valley forget she existed. Then the debt collector would move on, and she'd be free. Except she didn't feel free. She felt like a shadow. And Lucian Briggs, with his bleeding knuckles, and his lonely horse, and his refusal to run even when the whole town turned against him, made her remember what it felt like to be solid. 3 days later, Garrett Moss came to the bank. He wanted to see the original water contracts. Mr. Howell handed them over. Delia watched from her desk as Garrett read, his face darkening with each page. When he looked up, his voice was tight. This deed the surveyor's carrying. It's dated 1858. Our water rights are 1863. Federal trumps territorial, Mr. Moss. He slammed the contract on the desk. Then we buy him off. What's his price? Mr. Howell shook his head. He doesn't set the price. The railroad does. And they want the route. Garrett leaned in. Then we make him go away. Mr. Howell's voice went cold. That's not a solution. That's a hanging. Garrett left without another word. Delia's hands were shaking when she locked the files. She knew that look. She'd seen it on the faces of the men her father owed money to, right before they stopped asking politely. She waited until Mr. Howell left for lunch, then slipped out the back door and ran to the livery. Lucian was shoeing his mare, sleeves rolled up, face streaked with soot. She stopped in the doorway, breathing hard. You need to leave. Now. He set down the hammer. What happened? She told him. He listened without interrupting, then picked up the hammer again. I'm not leaving. She stepped closer. They'll kill you. He met her eyes. They'll try. But if I run, the railroad sends someone else, and it starts over. At least they know me. At least I can talk to them. She wanted to scream. Talking didn't stop that rock. It won't stop a rope. He straightened. Then what do you suggest? She didn't have an answer. What she had was a terrible, reckless idea that had been building since the moment he'd looked at her like she mattered. Marry me. The words fell out before she could stop them. He froze. She kept talking, fast, desperate. A married man with local ties is harder to run off. It gives you legitimacy. It gives me, she hesitated, protection. He put down the hammer. From what? She looked away. Does it matter? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, yes, she told him. Not everything, just enough. The bankruptcy, the shame. The men her father owed, men who didn't forget and didn't forgive. The way she'd been running for 2 years, changing names, changing towns, staying one step ahead of a debt she couldn't pay and a past she couldn't bury. When she finished, Lucian was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. That's why you're here. She nodded. And that's why you're leaving. She nodded again. Unless I have a reason to stay. He stepped closer. This isn't a reason. It's a trap. She met his eyes. So is dying alone in a stable, because you're too stubborn to ask for help. He smiled then, brief and bitter. You don't know me well enough to marry me. She almost laughed. You don't know me well enough to trust me. Seems fair. He shook his head, but she could see him thinking, weighing, calculating. What do you get out of this? A name that isn't mine. A place that isn't temporary. And maybe, she hesitated, someone who understands what it's like to be blamed for things you can't fix. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, he held out his hand. 1 year. We stay married 1 year. If it doesn't work, we part ways. No questions. If it does, he stopped. She took his hand. If it does, We figure it out. Deal. They were married 2 days later in the church, with the minister, Mr. Howell, and the livery owner as witnesses. Delia wore her best blouse and a borrowed shawl. Lucian wore a clean shirt and the same tired eyes. The vows were short. The kiss was brief. When it was over, the minister said, "May you find what you're both looking for." Delia wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a warning. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a rental that came with the marriage bargain Garrett Moss offered, in a last-ditch attempt to keep Lucian talking instead of surveying. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a table, and 2 chairs. Lucian took the floor. Delia took the bed. They lived like polite strangers, passing each other in the mornings, eating in silence, sleeping in separate spaces. But the town saw a married couple, and that was enough to buy time. The railroad sent a new engineer. He met with Lucian, reviewed the deed, and confirmed the route. Construction would begin in 3 weeks. The valley had 3 weeks to find a miracle or start packing. Garrett Moss called a town meeting. Delia went, sitting in the back, watching Lucian stand at the front and lay out the facts with the calm of a man who knew he was hated and had stopped caring. When he finished, someone shouted, "What if we just refuse to let them build?" The engineer, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, answered, "Then the federal marshal enforces the deed. And you lose everything, plus a fine." Silence. Then Garrett said, "What if we reroute the creek ourselves?" Lucian looked at him. "You'd need a new survey, new permissions, and about 6 months. You have 3 weeks." The meeting ended in shouting. Delia slipped out before the crowd turned ugly. She walked home in the dark, checking over her shoulder twice. When she arrived, Lucian was sitting on the porch, hat off, head in his hands. She sat beside him. "They're not going to let this go." He nodded. "I know." She hesitated. "What will you do?" He looked at her. "My job. Even if it kills you?" He almost smiled. "Especially then. At least I'll have done something that mattered." She wanted to argue, but she understood. "So instead," she said, "I'll make coffee." He followed her inside. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to Lucian's quiet breathing from the floor, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt safe. Not hidden, safe. There is a difference. Hidden meant alone. Safe meant someone watching your back. She rolled over. "Lucian." He stirred. "You awake?" "Yeah." She sat up. "Why'd you really say yes?" "To the marriage." He was quiet. "Then, because you looked at me like I was a person, not a problem. And I haven't felt like a person in a long time." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I know what you mean." Another silence. Then he said, "Go to sleep, Delia. We've got a long fight ahead." She lay back down. For the first time in 2 years, she believed him. The storm hit on a Tuesday. It came fast, boiling up from the south, turning the sky black and the air electric. Delia was at the bank when the first drops fell. By the time she locked up and ran for home, the street was a river. She stumbled through the door soaked and shaking. Lucian grabbed her, pulled her inside, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "You're freezing." She laughed, breathless. "It's just rain." Then the wind hit, The house shuddered. The window cracked. Lucien shoved the table against the door and pulled her into the corner. They huddled there as the storm screamed overhead, rain hammering the roof, lightning turning the world white and blue. She pressed against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and for a few desperate minutes, they were just two people trying not to get swept away. When the storm passed, they stepped outside into devastation. Half the town's roofs were gone. The creek had jumped its banks and torn through the fields, and Whisper Ranch, perched on the eastern slope, had lost its entire north pasture to a mudslide. Garrett Moss stood in the ruins, staring at the wreckage, face blank. Lucien walked up beside him. Delia followed. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The land was broken. The water was wild. And the railroad deadline was 2 weeks away. Garrett finally turned. "You're a surveyor. Can you tell me if there's any way to rebuild this before we lose everything?" Lucien looked at the torn ground, the shifted soil, the new path the water had carved. "Maybe. But it'll take every hand in the valley and a lot of luck." Garrett held out his hand. "Then let's get started." Lucien shook it. Delia watched, and something shifted in her chest. This was what it looked like when desperate men stopped fighting each other and started fighting the land. This was what it looked like when hope was a shovel, and a survey line, and a refusal to quit. They worked for 10 days. The whole valley turned out. Ranchers, farmers, shop owners, even the saloon girls, came with buckets and ropes. Lucien laid out the new route. Garrett organized the crews. Delia ran supplies, hauling water, food, bandages, anything that kept people moving. At night, she collapsed beside Lucien on the porch, too tired to talk, too bruised to care. He'd wrap her blistered hands in clean cloth. She'd check the cuts on his arms. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The work said everything. On the 8th day, the mare went down. She'd been working alongside the plow teams, hauling stones, dragging logs. Lucien found her lying in the pasture, breathing hard, eyes rolling. Delia ran for the veterinarian. He came, looked, and shook his head. Colic. Probably from bad water. Best thing is to put her down quick. Lucien knelt beside the mare, hand on her neck. "No." Delia crouched beside him. "Lucien." He looked at her, and his face was stripped bare. "She saved my life 3 times. I'm not giving up on her." Delia nodded. "Then we don't." They spent the night in the stable, walking the mare, massaging her belly, forcing water down her throat 1 cup at a time. Lucien talked to her, low and steady, the way he'd talked her down from the bolt. Delia stayed close, fetching blankets, boiling willow bark tea, keeping the lantern lit. Somewhere past midnight, the mare groaned and staggered to her feet. By dawn, she was drinking on her own. Lucien sat back against the wall, eyes closed, face gray. Delia sat beside him. He leaned his head on her shoulder. She didn't move. They stayed like that until the sun came up. When they walked back to the house, hand in hand, the whole town saw. By noon, everyone knew the marriage was real. Delia didn't correct them. Neither did Lucien. That night, he didn't sleep on the floor. She didn't ask him to. They lay side by side in the narrow bed, not touching, barely breathing, until finally Lucien said, "I don't know how to do this." She turned her head. "Do what?" "Be someone people count on." She reached for his hand. You've been doing it for 2 weeks. He laced his fingers through hers. What if I mess it up? She squeezed. Then we mess it up together. The new creek route was finished on the 12th day. The railroad engineer came to inspect. He walked the site, checked the survey, and frowned. This changes the water access. The deed specifies the eastern route. Lucian stepped forward. The eastern route no longer exists. The storm destroyed it. If the railroad wants to build, it'll have to use the new route or go around. The engineer's frown deepened. That'll add 2 miles in 3 months. Lucian crossed his arms. Then you'd better get started. The engineer stared. Then he smiled. You've got spine, Briggs. I'll take it to the company. No promises. Lucian nodded. That's all I'm asking. The engineer left. The valley waited. 3 days later, a telegram arrived. The railroad agreed to the new route. Construction would begin in the spring. Whisper Ranch kept its water. Juniper Valley stayed alive. And Lucian Briggs went from the most hated man in town to the one everyone wanted to buy a drink. Delia watched from the porch as Garrett Moss shook Lucian's hand, as the ranchers clapped his back, as the minister called it a miracle. Lucian caught her eye across the crowd. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But the look that passed between them was worth more than any celebration. That night, someone knocked on the door. Delia opened it. A man stood there, tall, thin, with cold eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Miss Tanner. Or should I say, Mrs. Briggs. Her blood went to ice. Lucian appeared behind her. Can I help you? The man tipped his hat. Name's Colfax. I'm here about a debt. Lucian stepped in front of Delia. What debt? Colfax pulled out a folded paper. Her father owed my employer $1,200. The debt transfers to the daughter. I'm here to collect. Lucian took the paper, read it, handed it back. This debt was discharged in bankruptcy 2 years ago. Colfax's smile widened. Not according to territorial law. Bankruptcy doesn't cover private contracts with penalty clauses. She signed as guarantor. The debt stands. Delia's legs went weak. Lucian's hand found hers. How much does she owe now? Colfax consulted the paper. With interest and fees, $1,800. Payable immediately. Or, he looked at Delia. Other arrangements can be made. Lucian's voice went cold. Get off my property. Colfax didn't move. You've got 1 week, Mrs. Briggs. After that, I take payment however I can. He tipped his hat again and walked away. Lucian closed the door. Delia collapsed into a chair. He knelt in front of her. Look at me. She couldn't. He took her face in his hands. Delia, look at me. She met his eyes. We'll figure this out. She shook her head. There's no figuring it out. I don't have $1,800. I'll never have $1,800. He stood. Then we find another way. They spent the next 2 days asking questions. The debt was real. The contract was legal. Colfax worked for a man named Voss, a loan shark with connections in 3 territories, and a reputation for collecting in blood when cash wasn't available. Delia had signed the guarantor clause at 16, desperate to help her father, not understanding what it meant. Now it meant she was trapped. Lucian sold his surveying equipment. It brought in $200. Garrett Moss offered $300 more, as thanks for saving the ranch. Mr. Howell quietly added another 100. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere close. On the 5th day, Lucian came home with a plan. We leave. Tonight. Take the train east. Start over. Let Voss chase ghosts. Delia stared at him. You'd walk away from everything you just built? He met her eyes. I'd walk away from the whole territory if it keeps you safe. She felt something crack open in her chest. I can't let you do that. He crossed the room, pulled her close. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing. There's a difference. She pressed her face against his shoulder. What if he follows? Lucian's arms tightened. Then I'll deal with him. But I'm not handing you over like your cargo. You're my wife. And I protect what's mine. She pulled back, searched his face. When did that happen? When did I stop being a bargain and start being yours? He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Probably around the time I stopped sleeping on the floor and started thinking about whether I'd survive losing you. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, 2 years of loneliness and fear pouring into one moment of absolute certainty. When they broke apart, she said, "We're not running." He started to argue. She pressed a finger to his lips. "We're not running. We stay. We fight. And if Voss wants me, he goes through both of us." Lucian closed his eyes. "You're going to get us both killed." She smiled. "Probably." He kissed her again. "Then let's make it worth it." On the 6th day, Colfax returned with 2 men. They came at noon, walking straight into the bank where Delia was working. Mr. Howell tried to stop them. Colfax pushed him aside. "Mrs. Briggs, time's up." Delia stood. "I need more time." Colfax shook his head. "You need $1,800. You don't have it. So we're leaving. Now." One of the men grabbed her arm. She drove her elbow into his ribs, twisted, ran for the door. The other man caught her. She screamed. The street exploded. Lucian hit the man like a freight train, slamming him into the wall, fists flying. Garrett Moss appeared from nowhere, shotgun leveled. The livery owner blocked the door. Half the town poured into the street, armed, angry, and done with strangers pushing people around. Colfax pulled a pistol. Lucian didn't stop. He grabbed Colfax by the collar, slammed him against the hitching post, and said, very quietly, "You touch her again, and I'll bury you where no one will ever find the body." Colfax's smile was gone. His eyes were flat. "You're making a mistake." Lucian's voice didn't waver. "No, you are." The marshal arrived an hour later. He listened to both sides, reviewed the contract, looked at Colfax. "This debt's legitimate, but the collection method isn't. You assaulted a woman in front of witnesses. That's jail time." Colfax straightened his coat. "My employer won't appreciate this." The marshal smiled coldly. "Then your employer can take it up with the judge. You're under arrest. Take him." The deputies hauled Colfax and his men away. The crowd cheered. Lucian pulled Delia close. She was shaking. "It's not over." He nodded. "I know. But we bought time." That night, they sat on the porch and counted their options. They had maybe 2 weeks before Voss sent someone else. They had $1,100. They had a town that would fight, but fighting wouldn't erase the debt. Delia leaned her head on Lucian's shoulder. Maybe I should just go. Face him. Settle it. Lucian's arm tightened around her. Over my dead body. She almost laughed. That's what I'm trying to avoid. He turned her face toward his. Listen to me. I spent 5 years running from a broken engagement, a scandal, and the weight of other people's expectations. I lost everything. My reputation, my career, my faith that anything I did mattered. Then I came here, and I met you. And for the first time, I had a reason to stop running and start building. I'm not losing that. I'm not losing you. Not to Voss, not to fear, not to anything. We find a way, or we make one, but we do it together. She kissed him, slow and sure. Then we need a miracle. He smiled. We've had a few of those lately. Maybe we're due one more. She closed her eyes. What if we're not? He pulled her closer. Then we go down swinging. The miracle came from an unexpected source. 3 days later, a lawyer arrived from Denver. He carried a briefcase and a telegram. He found Lucian at the Creek survey site. Mr. Briggs, I represent the estate of Jonathan Tate. Lucian frowned. I don't know that name. The lawyer opened the briefcase. Mr. Tate was the original surveyor who mapped the railroad route in 1858. He passed away last month. In his effects, we found a letter confessing that he falsified portions of the survey under duress from the railroad consortium. He wanted the truth known. This invalidates the original deed. Lucian stared. What does that mean? The lawyer smiled. It means the water rights revert to the territorial agreements. Whisper Ranch and the valley are protected. And it means the railroad owes significant reparations for the damages caused by the contested route. Lucian grabbed the papers, read them twice, then ran. He found Delia at the bank, pulled her outside, and told her everything. She listened, eyes wide. How much are the reparations? Lucian checked the letter. Enough to cover court costs, rebuilding expenses, and, he paused, compensation to affected parties, including surveyors hired under false premises. Delia's breath caught. How much? He met her eyes. $4,000. She sat down hard on the bench. We can pay the debt. He nodded. We can pay the debt. Buy a house and still have enough to start over if we want. Or stay if we want. She looked up. What do you want? He knelt in front of her. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build something that lasts. I want to stop running and start living. I want you, Delia. Not as a bargain. Not as protection. As my wife. My partner. The person I choose every single day for the rest of my life. She pulled him up, kissed him hard. Then let's stay. He smiled against her lips. Yeah? She nodded. Yeah. Let's stay. They paid off Voss's agent the next week. The man took the money, signed the discharge, and left without a word. Delia watched him ride out of town and felt 2 years of weight lift off her shoulders. Lucian wrapped his arms around her from behind. How does it feel? She leaned back against him, like I can breathe. He kissed the top of her head. Good. Because I plan on keeping you around a long time. The railroad reparations arrived a month later. Lucian split the surveyor's share. Half went to the Valley Recovery Fund. The rest, he handed to Delia. This is yours. Do whatever you want with it. She looked at the bank draft. What I want is a real home, he smiled. Then let's build one. They bought land on the edge of Whisper Ranch. A piece Garrett sold them cheap as thanks. They built a house with their own hands, room by room, board by board. The town helped. The ranchers hauled timber. The shop owners donated nails, glass, paint. By spring, the house stood solid and warm, with a wide porch, a stone fireplace, and enough space for the future they were building together. The mare grazed in the pasture. The creek ran clear. And every night, Delia and Lucien sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the valley they'd fought to save. 3 months later, word came that Voss had been arrested in Kansas for extortion and murder. The territorial judge seized his assets and dissolved his contracts. Every debt he held was voided. Delia received the notice and burned it in the fireplace. Lucien watched the paper curl and blacken. Feel better? She nodded. It's over. He pulled her close. No. It's just starting. They were married again in the spring, this time because they wanted to, not because they needed to. The whole valley came. Garrett stood as witness. Mr. Howell gave a toast. The minister smiled and said he'd known all along. The vows were the same. The kiss was longer. And when Lucien whispered, "I love you," Delia whispered back, "I know." He laughed. That's it? Just I know? She smiled. I've known for months. I was waiting for you to catch up. He kissed her again. I'm a slow learner. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Lucky for you, I'm patient. They settled into a rhythm. Lucien surveyed for the county, helping farmers optimize water access and settle boundary disputes. Delia kept the books for 3 ranches and the general store, building a reputation for fairness and sharp eyes. They worked hard. They fought sometimes, usually about money or whose turn it was to feed the mare. They made up every time, usually on the porch, watching the stars. And slowly, the fear faded, replaced by something neither of them had ever really believed in. Peace. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. The house grew. They added a 2nd bedroom, then a 3rd. Delia didn't say why. Lucien didn't ask. But when she told him she was pregnant, he picked her up and spun her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. He set her down gently, hands on her face. You're sure? She nodded. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. He kissed her, soft and reverent. We're having a baby. She smiled. We're having a baby. He laughed, wild and bright. What do we do? She took his hand. We keep building. The baby came in the winter, a girl with black hair and gray eyes, and a cry that could wake the dead. They named her Clara, after Delia's mother. Lucien held her like she was made of glass. Delia watched him pace the floor at midnight, singing off-key lullabies, and felt her heart crack open all over again. This was what they'd fought for. Not land, not water, not even freedom. This. A life built on trust, earned through fire, and strong enough to hold the weight of hope. Juniper Valley thrived. The railroad brought commerce. The ranches expanded. The town grew. And in the middle of it all, Delia and Lucien raised their daughter. tended their land, and loved each other with the fierce gratitude of people who knew how close they'd come to losing everything. On Clara's first birthday, they stood on the porch, watching her toddle after the chickens, and Lucian said, "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Delia leaned against him. Every day, he kissed her temple. "Regret it?" She shook her head. "Not for a second." He smiled. "Good, because I'm not done with you yet." She laughed. "Good, because I'm not done with you either." Years passed. Clara grew. The valley changed. New families arrived. Old ones left. Lucian's hair went gray at the temples. Delia's hands grew rough from work and soft from holding her daughter. They built a life measured not in gold or land, but in quiet mornings, shared work, and the steady accumulation of days that mattered. And when people asked how they made it work, Delia always said the same thing. "We stopped running and started trusting." Lucian would add, "And we got lucky." But Delia knew better. Luck was the horse bolting. Luck was the storm. Luck was the lawyer with the letter. What they had wasn't luck. It was choice. Every single day, they chose each other. And that made all the difference. On their 10th anniversary, they stood on the same porch where they'd first sat in awkward silence. Clara was asleep inside. The valley stretched out below them, peaceful and whole. Lucian took Delia's hand. "You ever think about that train ticket?" She smiled. "Sometimes." He looked at her. "Ever wish you'd used it?" She turned, framed his face with her hands. "Not once." Because running would have been easy. Staying was hard. And everything worth having, we built in the hard. He kissed her, slow and deep. "I love you, Delia Briggs." She kissed him back. "I love you, Lucian Briggs. And I'd choose you all over again." The stars came out. The night settled. And Delia Briggs, who had spent so long running from her past, finally rested in the arms of the man who taught her that home wasn't a place. It was a person. And she was already there.